Today we're going to finish discussing China, classical China. You know, in the last couple of weeks we've looked at classical civilizations. You know, we looked at Rome, you know, Greece and Rome, and the Greco-Roman classical civilization was a model inspiration for the civilizations that followed. It was a model for the subsequent cultures in Western Europe, in Europe in general, in the Western world. And we looked at classical India, and we saw the classic age of India, Indian philosophy, for example, with the Upanishads and with the philosopher and religious leader, I guess, Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. And today we're going to talk about classical China and how the events that occurred in China, which roughly correspond to the time of the Roman Empire in a lot of ways, in the Greco-Roman world, how the ideas and political systems that came into being at this time were a model for subsequent civilizations. In fact, to this day, for example, in China, ethnic Chinese refer to themselves as Han, H-A-N, and goes back to the Han Empire of the great Han Empire that was centuries earlier, when at the heyday of the classical Chinese period of history. All right, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. And then we're going to also look at classic civilizations that developed in the Western Hemisphere, in Mesoamerica, in Mexico, and South America. And very similar concept, like the civilization that developed at Teotihuacan in what is today the Central Valley of Mexico, and the area around Mexico City. That civilization, centuries later, when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they were still hearing stories that were passed down through the generations of that great empire, and that empire set the trend for the later civilizations, including the Aztecs, that were the great empire of Mexico when Europeans arrived on the scene in the 16th century. So it's very similar to what we see in China and in India and in the Western world. All right, so let's talk about China first. Now, when we last left China, we were talking about how during the period of the Eastern Chao, that's the dynasty, the Eastern Chao, after 771 BC, were really just figureheads. They were one state of many, and they were considered to be the first among equals, in other words. So sometimes when historians refer to this period, when they talk about these different states, they'll refer to these states as ruled by dukes, like the Duke of this or the Duke of that, kind of using as a parallel the situation in medieval Europe, where you had a king and nobles who were, in some cases, as powerful or more powerful than the king. And in China, during the period of the Eastern Chao, you had a similar situation. The ruler of the Eastern Chao was, quote unquote, the chief of chiefs. So, but his power was nominal, and the states were pretty much independent of each other. And this period of the Eastern Chao also marked the introduction of iron, and that iron technology, and that made iron tools, in particular, more common, and even so that even commoners had access to good quality iron tools. And one of the results of this was that it led to a lot more clearing of land and more agricultural production. And this in turn led to larger and larger populations. Especially when you get to the southern part of China, the Yangtze China, where you had at an earlier period of Chinese history, you had a lot of thick rainforests. It's a very tropical environment in southern China. And iron tools, just like in India, iron tools allowed these thick forests to be cleared and transformed into, and just like in the Ganges Valley, into rice fields. You know, in the south of China, it was rice rather than millet, that was the main staple in the people's diet, the main crop grown. Now, the period beginning around the 5th century BC saw it's called the period of warring states, because all these different states, well, they went to war against each other. That's a real good reason for calling it the era of warring states. But why were these states going to war with each other? Because Well, as their populations grew, prime farmland, especially along the river where you had access to good water, that became a really, they were really competing for this property, this really good farmland. And so as the population grew and good farmland became more scarce because of more and more population, then you had these states going to war with each other for territory, for control of this very good farmland to support their rising populations. Now, during the Warring States, with iron weapons, it became apparent that if you could put more larger and larger armies into the field, now that you had iron weapons, that was the key to victory. Just like we saw in the Iron Age in the Middle East with Assyria. In China, as armies got larger, they began to recruit more and more soldiers who were just commoners, not just... Now, remember, going back to the Chinese Bronze Age, going back to the Shang Dynasty, the warriors had always been typically an elite class because, well, bronze weapons were very scarce, and so the warrior class were the aristocratic class, traditionally in Chinese history. And they were the ones trained to fight off the chariots and the horses, and that's how war was conducted. Well, in the period of the Warring States, those days were over. You know, you had all these iron weapons, so that meant you had more soldiers who could fight, and that meant that you didn't have elite soldiers anymore. Now, another thing that happened during the period of Warring States was that rulers realized that some of these peasants were pretty smart. You know, just because you came from an elite family didn't mean that you were necessarily a better warrior or a better leader or a more loyal administrator than some lowly peasant. And so during the period of the Warring States, you had situations where lowly peasants were promoted to high positions because of their loyalty and service and ability to the ruler. And that, again, once more, these traditional elites were being bypassed. You know, they were the ones who were supposed to hold these high positions, and they were being passed over, and jobs were given to peasants on the basis of their ability and their loyalty to the ruler. So the period of the Warring States really created what we would call a social crisis, because these traditional elites, these traditional aristocratic families that went back centuries, all of a sudden they were nobodies. They no longer had a monopoly on power and position within China. Now, it was in this context that there developed, in the period of the Warring States, that this was a very period of a lot of social change. And historically, and you go all over the world, whenever you have a lot of social change going along, it often gets people thinking. And it's not a coincidence that the period of the Warring States is also one of the most dynamic periods of Chinese philosophy. Now, Chinese philosophy is a little different than, has its own unique characteristics, different than Indian philosophy. You know, Indian philosophy was all about, was rather metaphysical. It was about the reincarnation and being at one with Brahman or Nirvana. But Chinese philosophy, in broad strokes, was a lot more practical. I mean, the Chinese philosophy almost always focused on how to make society better. It was very this worldish. You know, it was very focused on this world rather than the next. And if you look at the great Chinese philosophies that developed in the period of the Warring States, they all seem to focus on how do you make what makes the best society? How are people going to be happy in society? Now, one of the greatest thinkers in Chinese philosophy was Confucius. And you can see his dates there. He would have been roughly a contemporary of Siddhartha Gautama. And he came from, and like Siddhartha Gautama, he came from a princely family. He came from a noble family. He was of a noble birth. And he realized that being of noble birth really didn't mean as much as it used to. And he looked around and saw a lot of chaos, a lot of war, and a lot of violence. And he was trying to figure out, how do you make China, how do you make people, how do you make society better? And that was his main focus. Now, he himself, like Buddha, he wrote nothing. Like Jesus, he wrote nothing. He didn't write anything. Instead, what we have are recollections of his sayings, his dialogues with his disciples. He traveled extensively, and because of his reputation for wisdom, he had a lot of followers, and he would speak to them, and they would ask him questions, and he would respond, and he would ask them questions. And eventually, his teachings were of his disciple, a man by the name of Mencius. You don't have to know that, but his disciple collected all the sayings and the dialogues that took place, and it was a book that's translated into English as the Analects. And this was one of the key books of literature for China. Now Confucius believed that he wanted to define a whole new way of looking at a nobleman. You know, traditionally in China, the nobleman was a warrior with his chariot and horses. And Confucius said, we need to rethink this idea. What truly makes a man a gentleman? What truly makes a person a nobleman? And the word for gentleman or nobleman was chunzu. And instead of a chunzu being a great warrior who went into battle, Confucius envisioned a chunzu, a gentleman, as being somebody who was very well educated. Someone who knew poetry, who knew history, who was well versed in tradition, well versed in the right rituals to honor the gods, someone who knew a great deal about the history of his country. And what Confucius did was to set up a system of education, a systematic educational process, where a person from a very young age would study poetry and history and study the traditions of China and learn all the ancient rituals to honor the gods and honor the ancestors. And he believed that if you developed these great minds, if you educated people to know about their history, to know about their culture, to be good, moral people, then these gentlemen in leadership positions could make society happy. Now, Confucius had a very positive outlook. He believed that most people were good, but they needed a little help. That you needed to have an educated elite who could be in positions of power to kind of guide people and to educate them and to bring them forward and to make sure that society ran smoothly. And one of his missions when he was a man when he was living was to travel around and try to convince rulers to adopt his educational system, to train their bureaucrats in this manner so that they could have this very well-educated elite who could run the country and run it effectively and lead to a happy and productive society. Now, another thing about Confucius was that he believed very strongly that harmonious relations between classes was the key. Everybody, he believed, everybody had a place. Everybody had a place in society, and that everybody needed to learn how to live to live in harmony with others. And so he also preached the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated, just like Buddha, just like you find in the Old and New Testament. And so it was very much focused on respecting and loving your neighbor. That was one of his key principles he taught. Now Confucius's philosophy wasn't the only philosophy on the table, though. In the period of the Warring States, there emerged other competing philosophies that would have a long-term impact on Chinese history. Another philosophy that developed in the period of Warring States it's known as Taoism. Now, sometimes you can spell it with a D, so it's Taoism, or Taoism, Taoism, the same thing. And it means, in Chinese, it means the way. Now, it developed probably in the 4th, 5th century, around that time period. But it was the reputed founder of this school of philosophy was a man by the name of Lao Tzu. Now, some people think that Lao Tzu is just an invention, a mythical, legendary figure. But so that's debated. But in many ways, Taoism was a reaction to the period of Warring States, just like Confucianism was, just like the ideas of Confucius. In Taoism, the idea was that the individual needed to flee from the state. Confucius wanted to make the state better by educating these chunzu to go out there and to be leaders and to lead the people and to make a great society. Taoism was about rejecting the state, and it was about learning how the individual needed to kind of mind their own business, kind of live close to the land. One of the favorite Taoism was taught in Proverbs. There were sayings that were passed down. There wasn't some kind of systematic textbook on Taoism. It was passed down through proverbial sayings that were attributed to wise men, to shamans. We'll talk about that in a minute. And one of their favorite sayings was, happiness is hearing the dog bark in the next village. You might think, what does that mean? The idea being that if you live in a village that's so remote and so quiet that you can hear the dog barking in the next village, that's happiness. To live close to the land, to raise your own food, to live close to nature. Taoism was very much into kind of rejecting the city, rejecting the hustle and bustle of a busy life, and kind of living a quiet, reflective life close to nature. And now another aspect of Taoism was that it was very anti-government. It was kind of like, hey, the government sucks. Let's kind of screw the government and kind of do our own thing and be at peace with ourselves. And it was often the leaders of Taoism were often holy men, guys who had a reputation for being like in touch with the divine. And across Asia, we find, and many people see in this kind of remnants of very primitive religion. And across Asia, in many areas of Asia, and even the more remote, among even the most remote tribes, you find these figures called shamans, who are considered to be people who can talk to the dead and have a mystical understanding of the universe and are well-versed in knowledge and wisdom. And they're considered to be holy figures. And in many ways, this shamanism, the shaman-like figure, we see in Taoism, in the sense that often the religious leaders who emerged in Taoism were people who had a reputation for having very special spiritual powers, to be able to talk to the dead, to leave their bodies and travel to distant areas with their mind and with their spirit. And now another thing about Taoism was that it often was, since it was anti-government, often Taoist leaders became leaders of secret societies that were anti-government, that were rebellious against the government. And so that was one of its, and it's also very, that was one of its attributes. And it's also very syncretic in the sense that a lot of times Taoism can blend with other ideas and other religious concepts. And so a lot of, when Buddhism was introduced to China in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, a lot of Taoism and Buddhism were merged, and you had a lot of borrowed concepts. So that would be yet another way of looking at the world that developed in this great age of Chinese philosophy. Now, a third way of philosophy is known by historians as legalism. Now, legalism believed in a strong state. It believed that if you want to really have happiness, you need to have a strong and powerful state. Now, that sounds a lot like Confucianism, but the difference is that legalism believed that human beings by nature are prone to evil. And the only way to keep peace and order in a society is to have a strong government and strong laws, hence legalism, strong laws to keep the people in check. And the only way to have strong laws is to have a strong state that can enforce those laws by force. So legalists believed also that you needed to have a strong government, but they believed that the key to strong government was a military and a government that enforces the law to keep the people in check. So Confucianism wanted to kind of guide the people along toward wisdom through having an educated elite, but legalism was like, we need to have strong laws because people are bad and we need to keep them in check, otherwise you're going to have anarchy and chaos. So these were kind of these competing political ideas, these competing philosophies that were in circulation in China during the period of the Warring States. Now, about the end of the 3rd century AD, though, the period of Warring States comes to the end with the emergence of a united China. And for the first time, all of China, or most of what is today historically China, was united by a single ruler. And he was originally the Duke of Qin. He was one of these regional rulers. And we get the name China from Qin. It's just a region in northwest China. And the Duke of Qin was able to unite by force all of the different states of China and establish himself. And when he established himself as the ruler of all of China, he assumed the title First Emperor. He created a whole new word in Chinese characters. And when he created the word emperor, he borrowed characters that were usually used to describe gods. Now, one of the reasons why they think they did this was because when he came to power, traditionally, for centuries, the Eastern Chao had been the first rulers, the ruler of rulers in China. So he had to come up with a way of trying to supplant that, of coming up with a way of trying to show that there was a new man, there was a new dynasty in town, and he was in charge. And so when he created this new position of emperor, he made it, the characters used to describe this new term were the same terms that were used to describe God. So he was saying that the emperor was somehow above ordinary men. He was a favorite of the gods, the son of heaven. And all the subsequent Chinese emperors refer to themselves as the sons of heaven, as being more than human, as being divine men living among human beings, as linking the heavens with the earth. You know, in Chinese traditional way of looking at the world the Chinese had, you had the land of the heavens, which was where the gods lived. You had the land of the dead below, and the middle kingdom was the land of the men, of human beings. And the emperor was the key, because he could travel to the gods, he could travel to the dead, he could honor the ancestors, he was the connection between all the three worlds. And so he wanted to really, the Duke of Qin really wanted to promote the idea that he was this divine figure that ought to be reverenced by the Chinese people. Now, so he did that. Now, another thing he did was that he decided to get rid of the whole previous system where you had these hereditary rulers ruling over different parts of China, and to replace them with officials that he appointed. And he created the translation of it as prefectures. Every part of China was divided up into provinces or prefectures, and each prefecture was governed by an appointee, a prefect appointed by the Duke of Qin, by the emperor. So he got rid of the hereditary system and replaced it with a system that every position in China was filled with somebody that he could trust, somebody who was loyal, somebody who was given a position on the basis of their ability and talent and loyalty to the dynasty. So he wasn't afraid to promote people from lowly circumstances. He based his appointees based on their ability and their loyalty to him. So he created a very centralized state where all the positions in the provinces were filled by his appointees. He also was a big believer in legalism, and so he really he created a strong army. Now, one reason why he was so successful in uniting China was because Qin was located right on the border with the Eurasian steppes, and so historically that province had always been attacked by barbarian hordes, these nomadic tribes living on the steppe. And so because they had to, the Dukes of Qin had always had strong military. They had to have the best military. And so that was a key reason for their success. They had the best military through lots of practice, and therefore they had a strong military to unite China. And he really believed in a strong military, because as a legalist, he believed the only way to keep the peace and to keep order was to have a strong, powerful state that could use coercion to keep its subjects in line. So he created a strong military, and he drafted people. He drafted peasants into the army in large numbers and built up a huge military force. Now, he also realized that he needed to have a defense from these barbarians. And so he began work. Another reason why the first emperor is important, he began work on what would eventually become the Great Wall of China, that great wall that was built to defend the northern Chinese border from barbarians from the steppes. And he didn't finish the Great Wall of China. It took centuries to build, but he began the process of fortifying the frontiers. He also had big plans to expand agriculture, and so he forced all the peasants to work day in and day out building irrigation canals, so more lands could be expanded for agriculture, and more crops could be grown. So he also built canals to link rivers to promote trade within China and agriculture. So he was very ambitious, and he put a lot of people to work. And he had a strong army to back him up. And so, if you were a peasant and you were drafted to build an irrigation canal or serve in the military, you did it because this guy was all powerful. He had the army to back him up. Now, another thing that he did. Now the thing about the Duke of Qin, though, is that, or the first emperor as he's called, was that he envisioned his dynasty lasting forever. And he decided that when he died, he was going to have the most spectacular tomb, because he was the greatest ruler that the world had ever known. And so he did build this fabulous tomb. And the miracle of it was that it was not discovered until the 1970s. And it's an amazing tomb. When we talk about the Shang dynasty, remember how the Shang dynasty used to kill people and place them in the tomb to accompany the ruler to the land of the dead? Well, he didn't do that. Instead, he crafted these lifelike ceramic statues, thousands and thousands of them. He had an army. You can see here's one, and this tomb must have taken lots of resources to build this tomb, because they constructed literally thousands of these life-size ceramic statues. Some were soldiers, some were courtiers, and the amount of detail. I mean, some of the soldiers were depicted as Caucasians, because we know that he kind of drafted barbarian troops from the steppes into his armies, and so the degree of detail is amazing. And every statue had unique characteristics to it. So all the figures of his court, his courtiers, his soldiers, his servants, were all kind of recreated as statues and placed in his tomb. And it's one of the most miraculous archaeological discoveries. Nobody knew that he took tremendous measures to make sure that nobody could find out where his tomb was located. And it wasn't until the 1970s that a peasant, stumbled upon it and discovered the tomb of the first emperor. But he must have put a lot of resources into the building this massive tomb that he constructed for himself. Now, the irony, of course, is that his dynasty did not last 1,000 years. It didn't even last past his son. He was a very unpopular king. He ruled with an iron hand. And when he died, he wasn't very well liked. And in fact, soon after his son assumed the throne, there were peasant uprisings. The peasants formed secret societies, and they didn't want to fight. They wanted to reject this dynasty. So there were massive peasant uprisings, and the army didn't like this guy either. The own army that he had created, they weren't loyal to the sons. So soon after this Duke of Qin died in 210 BC, there were uprisings and wars, and eventually one of the generals who had served under the first emperor, a man by the name of Cao Zu, he was of peasant origin, but he had risen up the ranks of the military, and he commanded the most loyal troops, and he was able to defeat all of his rivals and crush the peasant uprisings. And he is considered to be the founder of the Han Dynasty. Now, he did create a dynasty, and it's kind of in two parts, and the first part of it was the former Han from 206 to 8 BC. Now, the Han Dynasty, though, it continued this idea of a centralized state and using drafted peasants in the military, but it was a kinder, gentler government, you could say, because Kai Zu and his successors adopted Confucianism as the main political ideology of their state. And so under the former Han, it became established that positions in the government, if you wanted to be a prefect or if you wanted to serve in any kind of capacity in the government, you had to go through the Confucian educational system. You had to be trained in the way that Confucius had set out to be trained. And positions in the government were based on competitive testing. Everybody who wanted to get a government job would have to, if they wanted to get a job, would have to go through a series of tests to test their knowledge of Confucian ideals. So they'd have to have a thorough understanding of history, ritual, poetry, the whole gamut, the whole Confucius educational process. They'd be tested on that, and if they came out on top, they would get a position in the government. So positions in the government were based on your educational achievement and also on ability and on, of course, loyalty to the Han Dynasty. So they created a system that really perpetuated these ideals of Confucianism. And it was a much more gentler system. I mean, they assumed that people were good, but you needed to have these these Chunzu gentlemen who were well trained in the Confucian ideals to be the leaders of society and serve in government positions. So the Han Dynasty was able to create a system that gave China order and peace and prosperity for a number of centuries. All right. So if you look at a if you look at a map, here would be the Qin Dynasty. You see a map of it, and then here's the Han Dynasty. You can see the Han Dynasty at its height included much of what is today the Chinese mainland. So here's the borders of modern China, and here's the Han Dynasty. So it didn't include all what is today China, but at least half of what is today China was the Han Dynasty. All right, now all empires have flaws, and the Han Empire had flaws as well. And the flaw was succession, in the sense that just because you're born the son of whatever doesn't mean you're going to be a good job of being emperor. You see, they had a system in the Han Empire where every Han emperor would have literally hundreds of wives. It was for political reasons. You know, the emperor wanted to make sure that he had a wife from every family, every distinguished family in China would have one of their members as a wife of the emperor. So the emperor would have literally hundreds of wives, but of course there would always be one wife who the emperor would like more than anybody else, that one wife that had won his heart. And usually emperors, being human, they would want the son of their favorite wife to be their heir. Now, what happened in China was that all the women who were the wives of the emperor were kept segregated. They were kept away from all society. And they wanted to make sure that the emperor, that his son was really his son. So these women had no contact with any men other than the emperor. So they were segregated like a harem. And they had no contact with men other than the emperor. Now, of course, you need men around to like open jars and stuff like that. You know, men are useful for some things. So they would have men, but to make sure that these men couldn't do anything, they were eunuchs. They were castrated men. Boys would when they were boys, they would lose their testicles and their testicles would be removed. And so these were kind of like she-men. They were men, but they didn't have any ability to procreate. And they were called eunuchs. And these men were often the ones who were the guys who were the body servants of these women. Now, there was a lot of competition among these women to see who would be the favorite wife and whose son would be the next emperor. And so the environment within the harem was rather tense. I mean, you've all seen reality shows of cheerleading moms. Or there's that show Dance Moms. You ever seen that? Now imagine if the stakes weren't who's going to be the next cheerleader, who's going to be the next dance star. Imagine if the stakes were who's going to be the next ruler of the world. I mean, that would be pretty. Now that would be a reality show to watch. You know, the harem of China. Who will be next emperor? You know, and have the women all competing with each other, and they poisoned each other, and they told lies, and they tried to manipulate the emperor to like them more than the other wives, and it was very intense. And so, imagine if you're a child growing up in that environment, where you couldn't trust anybody. And everybody was out to kill each other to see who would be the next emperor, who would be the favorite wife. And whoever was the empress, the one who was the favorite wife, she was called the Dowager Empress because she usually had lots of power and influence because she was the favorite wife and her son was the heir to the throne. So she always wielded a great deal of power. Now, what would happen in China is called the dynastic cycle in the sense that it's called the cycle in the sense that Chinese historians noted that when a dynasty first started, the rulers were usually pretty strong and pretty good. But over time, you had these children growing up in this kind of stilted environment. Over time, the emperors became increasingly weaker and weaker and inferior. And when these inferior emperors came to the throne, they often were like reliant. They often relied on their mother for advice. They weren't very strong. They often turned more and more to their eunuchs. You got to remember that these kids grew up in an environment where they didn't have a male model. Their only male role model was a eunuch. And these eunuchs, they were trained to be body servants. They didn't have the education. They were trained to, fan and give massages and stuff like that. But these eunuchs, they wanted to be powerful. They wanted to have influence. So a lot of times, these emperors, they would turn to their eunuchs to be their advisors and to be the people calling the shots. And so you had these uneducated guys, these eunuchs, kind of running China. And these emperors who were weak-willed and not kind of incompetent, kind of relying on the eunuchs to do all the work for them. And this created a situation where the Chunzu, the scholar gentlemen, were kind of like, what's going on here? Why should I take orders from some eunuch? This guy has no education. He doesn't even have any testicles. Why should I listen to this guy? And so over time, when you had weak emperors ruled by weak eunuchs who were more interested in their own personal aggrandizement than running China, you had a situation where the provinces were left on their own and often grew restive, and the governing elites, the bureaucrats, were unhappy. And so over time, China would become more and more disorganized and decentralized, as when the government was weak at the center, the provinces would kind of go their own way. Now also what happened would be, at the local level, powerful landowners would see a weak government as an opportunity to advance their own interests. So what happened often in many of the provinces would be that powerful landowners became laws to themselves. They were so powerful, so wealthy that they kind of ran their own realms. Kind of think of mafia bosses. They had their own little domain that they ran because the central government was too weak to take care of them, to deal with them. So and a lot of times these local landlords, these local landowners who were powerful would become a law unto themselves and would be above the law, and this would create problems and unhappiness throughout China. So this was a problem for China. Now, in 8 BC, the Dowager Empress at the time, she had a nephew named Wang Mang. And Wang Mang, he was very ambitious. And in 8 BC, he overthrew the reigning emperor and made himself emperor in his stead. He overthrew the Han dynasty. And when he did this, he was very aggressive. He realized that the problem that China faced were these powerful landlords, these powerful landowners in the provinces. So with the backing of the army, he announced that he was going to break up the big estates. He made it a law that all these big landowners, they were going to have to give up their land, and it was going to be redistributed to the peasants. So that instead of having these big, huge estates, he wanted to break the power of the landowners because he saw them as the problem. And if he broke up their estates, that would weaken them, and that would make the central government stronger. And so that was his plan. Well, unfortunately for Wang Mang, though, he had some problems of his own. First of all, he had to deal with an invasion. The Huzhong No. Now, some people believe that these were the Huns, the later Huns who invaded India and the Roman Empire. But at this point in history, in 20 AD, they were living in what is today Chinese Turkestan and in Central Asia. And and all of a sudden China was attacked by these barbarians, and Wang Mang's armies lost, and they were unable to successfully defend China. And at the same time, there were some natural disasters, some terrible flooding that occurred, and some famines where lots of people were dying. Now, the Chinese people believed, they've been taught to believe, that the emperor was the son of heaven, that the emperor was the favorite of the gods. And when the people of China saw that under Wang Mang that the country was being invaded by barbarians and that there were natural disasters, many Chinese people began to think, hey, maybe this Wang Mang isn't a real emperor. Maybe he doesn't have the mandate of heaven. Maybe he isn't chosen of the gods. Maybe he isn't qualified to be emperor, because obviously the gods are punishing us with famines and floods and disasters and invasions. And so all of a sudden there were these massive peasant uprisings. They formed the secret societies often led by religious shamans. And the Chinese were in rebellion against Wang Mang. And the army, seeing that this guy had lost popular support, the army assassinated Wang Mang in 23 AD. And the result was that there was a civil war among rival generals, and a man by the name of Guang Wu. Now, Guang Wu was a leading general, but he was also was related by blood to the Han dynasty. So he was of the Han family. So he was of the same dynasty. And that gave him an edge over his rivals. That he was of the blood of the Han dynasty. But he was able to defeat all of his rivals, and he established himself as the emperor of all of China, and he established what is called the later Han dynasty that ruled from 25 AD to about 220 AD. And so you have the later Han dynasty. Now, you had the same situation. The first rulers of the later Han dynasty were pretty effective, but what happened was a repeat of what had happened earlier. You had more and more weak rulers, dominated by their eunuchs, dominated by their wives, who didn't really govern China very well. And then you had local aristocrats, local landowners who were powerful, usurping the power of the government. With the absence of a strong central government, you had a situation where local officials kind of were on their own, and powerful landowners were in a position to dominate local governments. So China grew increasingly weak, with a weak central government and weak emperors. And this situation made the Han Empire, by the 3rd century AD, made it open to invasion. And then what happened is that in the 3rd century AD, the Han Empire was inundated with barbarian tribes. Now, all these tribes were from the steppes of Asia. They were nomadic people with their horses and raising livestock, but they were warriors. And in the 3rd century, China was invaded by these barbarian tribes. So just like the Hassin P, which many people think were an early form of the later Mongols. The Toba, which many people think were the ancestors of the Turks. And the Wanwan, which many people think were the predecessors of the later Avars. We're going to hear about the Avars later. You got to remember, these steppe peoples, they could travel vast distances across the steppes of Asia on their horses, and so they covered a lot of ground from China all the way to the Ukraine and Hungary and Eastern Europe. So these people, these barbarians, could travel widely over a large area. I mean, after all, the Huns did give their name to Hungary in Eastern Europe. Question?
Would Charlemagne later fight the Avars? Is that true? I heard.
Yeah, he did, and the Avars would make their way all the way to and settle in the Hungarian Valley, the Danube River Valley, in the 7th century AD. But in the 3rd century AD, they were all the way located in China. They traveled over the century over vast distances. So basically, China was invaded by these barbarian tribes. And now what happened with these barbarian tribes, though, is that when they actually invaded China and settled in China, over time, they adopted the culture and lifestyle of the Chinese. So basically, China had the ability to kind of absorb these invaders. Now, often what would happen is in the northern parts of China, these invaders would form the new ruling class. They would become the new powerful landowners and the ruling class of China. Now, what we see happening over the next several centuries in China was that China was disunited, and you see a number of different states emerge, each trying to kind of reestablish the Han Empire. And then the Han Empire was the model. And so these dynasties that emerged later all tried to, in different ways, reestablish what the Han Empire had. And so the Confucian system would be the model, and but they were unsuccessful. So, for example, in the southern part of China, from 220 to 589 AD, you had six different kingdoms established. Sometimes they were concurrent with each other. But for 300 years, southern China was divided up into different states, and you had a succession of different states over this period. In the northern part of China, along the Yellow River, you had 16 different states over a 300-year period, trying to establish themselves. Many of these states were founded by descendants of barbarian invaders of the 3rd century AD. Now, of these 16 kingdoms, one of the more successful of them was the Northern Wei Kingdom from 386 to 534 AD. They were actually descended from Turks. They were who had adopted Chinese culture. Now, I mentioned the Northern Wei because the Northern Wei was one of the few Chinese kingdoms that officially adopted Buddhism. The Northern Wei rulers adopted Mahayana Buddhism, and for a brief period, that was, in this particular kingdom, that was the official religion, and the Northern Wei were responsible for allowing for the spread of Buddhism within China. But for the most part, most states allowed people to follow Buddhism, but most states remained true to their the ideals of Confucianism. Even though they might allow Buddhist monasteries to be established, in most areas of China, Buddhism was a religion that was tolerated, but not the official religion. The Northern Wei would have been an exception to that. But very important in spreading Buddhist art and Buddhist literature and Buddhist ideas across China. That would be the Northern Wei. All right, so that's China. All right, why don't we've gone for a little bit of we've gone for quite a while, so let's take a little break now. Take our break, and you stretch and finish your folders if you haven't done so. But I want you to consider something. All right, and we just kind of review what we've covered. I want you to think, we've talked about the 3 different philosophies that developed in Chinese history during the period of Warring States. So I want you to identify those 3 different thoughts, schools of thought. And I want you to, how did they respond? How did they respond to the growth of the state during the period of Warring States? How did they respond to the period of Warring States? So that's what you want to discuss within your group. Identify the 3 different schools of thought and how each school of thought responded, how they dealt with the period in which they were living, the period of the Warring States. All right, so that's your thought of the day, so that's your exercise, and to review that among your members. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about some of the societies that developed in the Western Hemisphere, and in particular Mexico and Central America and in South America. And one of the great classic civilizations are the Maya. Now, the Maya lived in their heyday, lived in what is today southeastern Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula, and also in Central America, in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and those areas. and it's a very hot, humid area, but it has good soil because there's a history of volcanic activity, and volcanic soil is usually very fertile soil. But so it could support a very large population. Now, when people look at the history of the Maya, anthropologists divided it up into different eras, and not being very inventive, archaeologists call it the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic. Before the classic, and the after the classic, in a nutshell. And now, in the pre-classic period, you can see the emergence of the first and earliest Mayan states, like in the site of Syros. Now, I don't know what the Spanish, any Spanish speakers here? Spanish, know how to pronounce Spanish words. All these words are obviously Spanish because they're Spanish place names, because Spanish is spoken in this part of the world. But we don't, in some cases, we don't know what the ancient name of the site city was. But at Syros in 50 BC, we see one of the first Mayan states. Now, the Mayans owed a great deal to the earlier Olmec, in the sense that if you were to visit a Mayan city, you'd find that it was a place of monumental architecture. There, where you'd find at Syros, for example, you find a central plaza or square surrounded by these large pyramids, and the pyramids were flat on top. So it's assumed that on the top of at the top of the pyramid, instead of a point, you find a temple where religious rituals occurred. Also, you would find in the city residences of the elite. So just like among the Olmec, your typical Joe did not live in the monumental ceremonial city. They lived out in the countryside, maybe in a little village, and in the city, like at Syros, you'd find the monumental buildings, the pyramids, but you'd also find elaborate residences where, made of stone, where the elites, the kings and their officials and the priests lived. So that's one of the earliest Mayan cities at Syros. Here you can see an example of, this is from Belize, you can see the example of a square surrounded by pyramids. You can see the pyramid has, from this picture, you have like kind of steps, kind of like a ziggurat in a lot of ways, but then you have the temple at the top, and you have a ceremonial stairway that leads to the top of the. I went to Belize, and I actually tried to walk on one of these stairs. It was kind of scary because there's nothing to hold on to. You're kind of doing this, but pretty amazing. I mean, these things are huge. These pyramids. They're kind of built on top of each other. They would build them in stages, so they would take, in some cases, generations to build. But they're very impressive. When you get to the very top, you can kind of see all the jungle panoply. It's very beautiful. But anyway, so you got these pyramids in the central ceremonial plaza. Now, another important site is in Guatemala. It's called El Mirador. It dates to about 50 AD. And again, you find the ceremonial plaza, and you also find the pyramids. But what's important about El Mirador is that it's the first example of writing. The Mayans developed a hieroglyphic script. It was both syllabic and phonetic and symbolic, all rolled into one. It was a very, very complicated system of writing, where symbols could stand for syllables, they could stand for sounds, and they could also stand for ideas. So it's kind of a mixture of Chinese characters, syllabic cuneiform script, and our own alphabet, all kind of rolled into one. So obviously it was very complicated. So probably we know from the Mayans that being able to read and write was an elite thing to do. Only the elites could read or write because it was such a complicated system. So it wasn't something that the common Joe could learn. Very different from the Greek alphabet or the Phoenician alphabet that was more simple and easier for people to read and understand. But it was very complicated. And at El Mirador, they found the first of these upright stones. What would happen, they're called the stele. And on it, it's an upright stone with carvings on it that has writings on it. And Mayan rulers would set up a stele or stone column and use it to record important events in their reign. important achievements. So, and now we know that the Mayans would use other forms of materials to write. They would use deer skins to create parchment. They used bamboo type material to record writings, but these are perishable materials. So now, when the Spanish arrived, they found that on parchments made of deer skins, the Mayans had written extensive records, but the Spanish priests burned them all because they were considered to be, pagan and evil and demonic. So they burned a lot of them. So unfortunately, we don't have those. Some of them were transcribed by Spanish priests, so they have a better understanding of the Mayans. So we have some information from those sources. But these stone inscriptions that they left on stele, these they're written in stone, so they're not perishable. And we know a lot about Mayan history from these inscriptions, these monumental inscriptions that Mayan kings set up. Now, so what do we know? Now, the amazing thing about Mayans is that their discovery of their writing, we knew about their writing for a long time, but it's only been in the last 40 years that Mayan hieroglyphics has been translated. So it's taken a while, thanks to those Spanish priests who recorded some of the Mayan history. Modern historians have been able to decode it, modern scholars. So we now know a lot more about the Mayans because slowly but surely these ancient texts, these monumental writings are being translated and understood. Now, we know from these writings that Mayans were divided up, even though they shared a common culture, they were divided up into a bunch of different city-states. And each city-state was ruled by a king. Now, these kings were priests. They were priests and kings. So they performed important religious rituals in addition to being military men. These kings were a lot into the military. The Mayan rulers were almost constantly at war with one another. Now, one of the reasons why they were at war with one another was that Mayan kings were always trying to impose tribute on other city-states. So you want one city-state would want to force other city-states to pay them tribute, like in slaves or in food, like corn, or precious objects like jade or bird feathers that were considered luxurious, or whatever the tribute had to be. But the king who collected the most tribute from subject cities was obviously the most powerful king. Another thing they waged war was because kings always wanted to install a member of their family to be the ruler of a neighboring state. Because the more family members you had installed as subject kings, the more powerful you were. So they're always waging war to establish tributary states or to impose a member of their family as the ruler of a neighboring state. Wars were constant. And we know about these wars because whenever they waged a war, when they were successful, they would put it up on an inscription. They also were priests, so when they conducted important rituals like a ball game, the Mayans would build these elaborate ball courts where they play a game. They'd use a rubber ball, and now this game was found all over the area. It stretched from, eventually they have ball courts built in southern Arizona later in history, but it was a game that was practiced throughout the region, from Arizona all the way to Mexico. But there were different varieties of it, but it basically involved the game where it's kind of like basketball, where you had to get the rubber ball into a hoop, but you couldn't use your hands or your feet. So you'd have to bounce the ball off your parts of your body, and it was like a team sport. We know from records that if you won the game, you got to be sacrificed to the gods. So the honor of winning went, if you won a game, you got to be killed. But you weren't just killed, you were made a special sacrifice to the gods. Now the ball game was supposed to, in Mayan mythology, there were these two twin brothers who were the founders of the Mayan people, and they killed the death god. They killed death. They achieved victory over death and used his head to play a ball game. So the ball game commemorated the victory of life over death, so it had religious significance. So it was kind of like among the Mayans, football really was a religion. Literally. I mean, the ball game was religious significance, and they would bet money on it. It was like a big social event. I mean, people would come all the peasants would come for miles to watch a ball game, and they would bet. The Spanish told tales of people betting their own children into slavery over a ball game. You know, they were just intent on it, but it had special significance to them. And Mayan kings, when they built a ball court and held a ball game, they would put it up on steel. So I conquered this state and this state, and I had a ball game.
Well, just out of curiosity, I mean, you can't ignore all the similarities between these cultures and cultures on the other side of the globe. Where do you modern day historians say that all inhabitants of North and South America came across the Bering Strait? Where do you think that they came from?
These ideas?
Yeah, I mean,
I think
actual people and cultures themselves, and how these ideas may have gotten here to where they were shared in similarity.
I think that a lot of times ideas can develop independently. I mean, I think that human beings are human beings, and they have a common way of looking at the world, and a common. So human beings find themselves in similar situations will come up with similar solutions to one another. So I think that accounts for the similarity. I'm not a big believer in space aliens introducing these ideas or believing that there was somehow, I don't think you necessarily have to have people from one part of the world. There might have been visits. There is some evidence, archaeological evidence of visits of other people. You know, there might be people from Japan might have made it away to South America. They just found recently that birds, there are certain chickens in California that are related to Asian chickens somehow, and that this was recently introduced within the last 2,000 years. So, there might have been some interaction between different parts of the world, but I think a lot of this is just, ideas. People find themselves in similar situations, come up with similar solutions to those problems, and because we're all human beings, we all have basically the same DNA, right? We're all descended from Adam and Eve, right? So, hey, there you go. All right, did that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. I just kind of am curious about what your idea is, how the people actually got to South America as well.
Well, that happened probably thousands of years earlier. But yeah, there's the Bering Strait idea that they crossed over from Asia from Bering Strait about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's the archaeological evidence. Some people thought that they might have made it across the Atlantic from Western Europe during the last ice age, using hunting seals and making it way from one ice flow to the other. There's another theory that they might have come from Japan and Polynesia, that area, and crossed the Pacific using the same similar idea. There's some evidence that Native Americans are descended from Caucasians from East Asia. So they're not just people related to the East Asians from China. They might be related to Caucasians who at one time inhabited Central Asia and Asia thousands and thousands of years ago. So there's a lot of different. Nobody really knows. In other words, there's a lot of theories, but the most common theory is that the vast bulk of them crossed over the Bering Strait from up in Alaska, from Siberia, and then made their way over the centuries and populated the two hemispheres. That's the most common prevalent theory. The other ones are kind of just put out there for review. Did that help you? Okay. Now from these one reason why these rulers were so intent on expansion was because internally they weren't really that in charge. We know from archaeology that local landlords had built palaces outside of the cities. So the priest king might have been all powerful in theory, but within each state we know that there were powerful individuals who had their own palaces outside of the city that were powerful in their own right. And one of the theories is that one reason why Mayan kings were so intent on collecting tribute and trying to impose their rule over other cities was because they were trying to strengthen their internal position. They were trying to establish themselves as kings and show the nobles within their realm that they were powerful. With each of these nobles, when they built their own palaces, they were in their own right, redistribution centers. They had their own craftsmen, their own peasants that they collected tribute from. And so these powerful aristocrats were powerful within themselves. Now, we know from history that at different times certain Mayan cities were more powerful than the other. For example, Tikal in Guatemala in about 500 AD, it was probably had an empire that, according to some estimates, included about 500,000 people and was the most powerful state for a number of centuries among the Mayan states. But its great rival was also nearby, the state of Palenque. And we know that one of the greatest rulers in Mayan history was Pakal of Palenque. He sees dates there. He was ruler from the time he was a boy till he was in advanced age, and was considered the most powerful of Mayan rulers. You know, a lot of Mayan rulers claimed descent from him. And Palenque was a great powerful state for a long period of time. Now, concurrent with the Mayans was another culture located in central Mexico, around what is today Mexico City, and it's the state of Teotihuacan. And it was a state. Some people have likened it to Assyria, in the sense that they were warriors, and when they conquered other peoples in other parts of Mexico, they would bring them to the Central Valley of Mexico and work them as slaves. And Teotihuacan was an interesting city in the sense that it didn't have one palace; it had like a multitude of palaces. So one of the theories is that at Teotihuacan, instead of having one king, you might have had a royal council, like a group of officials who each had their own palace and their own section within the city. But the one thing about Teotihuacan was that it was, I'll go a little over, but I want to get this covered. One reason why it was so successful is because there was the people were afraid of it. The stories that were later told by Teotihuacan was that one of the ways that they instilled fear among their subjects was massive human sacrifices. That when they defeated a subject people, thousands upon thousands of people would be sacrificed as human sacrifice to their gods. And they built these giant pyramids, almost down here. The Pyramid of the Sun is one of the biggest buildings in the Western Hemisphere. It's huge, giant construction. You can still visit it in the area of Mexico City to this day. And one of the gods that they worship would be a god that would be worshipped down to the ages. Even the Aztecs would worship it. Quetzalcoatl was one of their gods. He was called the feathered serpent because he was the lord of the heavens, the birds and feathers, and the lord of the earth, hence the serpent. And he was the god that they honored with one of the main gods that they honored with massive human sacrifices. But anyway, now that we don't know what happened to Teotihuacan, but about 750 AD, the whole city was destroyed, and all that was left of the memories of the terror of Teotihuacan. And they had such a terrifying reputation that when the Spanish arrived, they would still hear tales about these powerful rulers who sacrificed thousands to their gods and worshipped Quetzalcoatl. And the worship of Quetzalcoatl continued even after Teotihuacan was leveled and destroyed in some kind of either a rebellion or uprising by its subject people. All right. Well, y'all, that's what we're going to get to today, and we'll talk about Byzantium and Islam on Monday, and Wednesday we're having the exam. On the 6th, yeah.